Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who contribute their ideas, their gifts, and their energy to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions have pleased them the most? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. Minette Doederer's name is synonymous with Iowa politics. She served as a state representative from 1964 to 68 and a state senator from 69 to 78. In 1981, she was elected again to the Iowa House and continues to serve. Minette was the first woman in the General Assembly to be elected to a leadership position when she was named House Minority Whip in '67. As President Pro Tem of the Senate for 2 years, she attained the highest position ever held by a woman in the Iowa legislature. She ran for Lieutenant Governor in 1970 and 78. Minette was very active in the League of Women Voters in the early 60s. In 1979, she was named to the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame. 10 years later, Minette Doederer was awarded the Equality Justice Medal given by the Iowa Commission on the Status of Women. Doederer has been a leading advocate of women's rights during her career in the legislature. Many other issues have received her attention and support: correction reform, juvenile justice laws, child abuse law, education, discriminatory employment practices. She was one of the founding members of the Iowa Women's Political Caucus and co-chair of the International Women's Year Coordinating Committee. A native of Holland, Iowa, Minette received her BA in economics from the University of Iowa. She and her husband Fred raised 2 children in Iowa City, Denny and Kay. Welcome, Minette, to Tell Me Your Story.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Ellen.
Your story begins May 16th, 1923, when you were born in Holland, Iowa. Tell me a little bit about your parents.
My father was a farmer, a son of a farmer. They were both second-generation immigrants from Germany, and they worked hard, and they were victims of the Depression after the crash, or during that time, and had to leave the farm, and my father became a worker at a packing company in Waterloo, and then he went into business. And mother worked in restaurants. They were hardworking Iowans.
So anybody in politics in your background?
No, but my father was always very interested. He vacillated between being very supportive of unions and then sort of anti-unions when he had his own business. And I think that's probably the way most people are. It's that sort of pocketbook issue.
You came to Iowa to go to school and graduated in 1948. Then you were married right after
No,
college?
I worked right out of high school for 3 years at John Deere Tractor Company in Waterloo. And they allowed me, way back then in the 40s, to go half-time so that I could start at what was then Teachers College in Cedar Falls. So I commuted between John Deere's and the college at that time, and then was married in my second year at the college. And then Fred was in the service, had been for quite a while, and was going to go overseas, so I left college and went down to Texas, and we were married there. Well, he never got his overseas call. So after he was discharged in 1946, we moved to Iowa City, because he had a year left, and I had 2 years left to do. And we settled in Iowa City and never left.
You're back in Iowa City now, and I want to know when you decided to get involved in politics. Was it your start in the League of Women Voters, Minette?
Well, that, and my father was very interested in politics. He never really participated, except that he did tell me, I think in 1912, he led the Bull Moose Party for Theodore Roosevelt in Grundy County. That was his only involvement. But we did talk a lot of politics at home. But it never occurred to me as a woman that I would run. But at the time were called back into session by Governor Hughes to reapportion. I was the league chair of the reapportionment study, and I felt I knew it as well as anyone. So, and I also felt that I would go just for the reapportionment session, not for a lifetime as it turned out.
Tell us a little, for people who are new to Iowa and to Iowa City, a bit about reapportionment.
Well, the legislature did not represent the people with the votes in the legislature. The number of people from each legislative district was very unequal. One legislator represented 7,000 people in a county, and others represented 50 or 60,000, depending upon the size of the county. And that was true in both houses. But the United States Supreme Court said that the legislature had to reflect the population of the state. And that's in 1964, when we went into special session. That was our goal, to respond to the Supreme Court's directive.
Okay, so in '64 you decided to run, and you were wrestling with the idea about leaving your children. Your children were how old, Manette?
13 Kay was 13 and Dennis was 15, and they were very involved in their school activities. And we met in February, so I had to leave them during school. And I thought if I was rich, I could leave them for a vacation or cruise or something. But for my Grundy County soul, which was very traditional, I thought leaving your children was just not right. Well, I persuaded myself that it was more important to leave them this one time. But after I got to the legislature and got into how laws are made and how people interact, I was, as I always say, hooked. And actually, my opponent in that first campaign said, and it was Dale Erickson, who's still Iowa City, he was saying that Manette only wants this one time. If you'll elect me, I'll be there for longer. And I denied that, but it turned out.
Here you are, 28 years later. Did you go in, I know reapportionment was a big interest of yours. Was women's rights, equality, job discrimination, did you learn that on the job, shall we say, or was that something you went to the legislature carrying that banner?
No, actually, I was a very traditional woman. I felt I had to work part-time because my mother-in-law was in a nursing home and we needed some extra money to help her. And I did work part-time at the University Memorial Union, and I subbed for secretaries and various places on campus because we needed some extra money. But I thought you should stay home with your kids at that time. And as a matter of fact, when I campaigned that first time, people asked me what would happen to my husband. It was more, who could take care of my husband? That was the tradition out there. And I kept telling him he was all grown up and could take care of himself. But I did not. Society hadn't told me that I could be a legislator, and that's where I got my messages in those days.
And then I read in the research about you that once you got in Des Moines at the state level, you started getting letters from women with their problems and how they were discriminated against and unfair against, and you...
I don't think they even used the word discriminated against in those days, but they just felt that the court, in divorce settlements, in child support settlements, and in even then abuse from their husbands or their partners, they felt very much abused. And the court system and the police system just didn't listen to them. It was a totally male society and male-oriented, and everyone assumed that we were all good religious people, and no one would treat their children or their wife or their spouse that way. And it was early also that local women were very involved, a few local women were very involved in the abortion issue. They were sending women from Iowa City and Iowa to Mexico, to Kansas, to Canada for abortions. And frankly, at that time, I wasn't even aware that there was a problem with pregnancies. So women did write me, and ministers of this state wrote me about problems of women. And first thing I knew, I was totally sympathetic to them. Not having experienced any of those things myself, the things I experienced as a child was poverty. Yes, poverty. It was very bad during the Depression. But I didn't know about mistreatment of family members and that sort of thing. But they made a believer out of me in a hurry, and I still have some of those letters that they wrote me about how their husbands mistreated them, how actually they were almost captive in their own homes, some of them.
So you've been involved in these issues, but there's also a lot of other issues you've lent support and guided through, laws changed, correction reform.
Yes, and I started that with juvenile justice, actually.
Tell me about that.
Well, a committee of the legislature where I was appointed to look into the Mitchellville Institution, for example, which was where they kept girls who were wayward, and found out that 60% of the girls at Mitchellville at that time were in there for problems which they called sex problems. And it turned out what the sex problems were is that they were abused by members of their own family or roomers in their own family. And at that time, instead of doing something about the offender, they took the girl out of the home to solve the problem, and they were in Mitchellville and incarcerated, so to speak. And it was not a kind institution at that time. The girls couldn't walk on the grass, for instance, and they had lots of problems. So that led to knowing about adult offenders and how they start as children.
Looking back over this 26 years actually, but it's been 28 years since 1964, what are the things that you've accomplished that have pleased you the most?
Well, I think getting the Equal Rights Amendment before the voters in 1980 and now again this next election pleased me, because women actually aren't in the Constitution, even though those who are opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment would tell you they are, but they actually aren't. We had to get a special amendment in order to get the vote. Or if we had been in the Constitution, we would not have needed that. That pleases me the most, that women will finally become equal under the law if the voters accept that amendment next year.
And it will be on the
next
ballot
November.
when? November 1992.
That's right.
What have been some of your toughest times in the House and the Senate?
Well, I think the toughest time was when I was in the Senate in 1975, when I became the President pro tem. I got into a disagreement with the majority leader, Mr. Kinley. And it was a silly disagreement. It was at the time that Nixon was president, as I remember, and there was a great deal of discussion about Mr. Nixon and his tapes, and those tapes being monitored, and he monitored people. Well, Mr. Kinley asked me if I would monitor. He didn't ask me. He told me I was going to monitor the committees. There were not a lot of new senators in at that time, and I told him I would be glad to help them. I'd be glad to go to the committees and make suggestions, but could we use a different word than monitor? Well, Mr. Kinley was just an old German, as I was, and he took offense that I disagreed with him, and we had difficulties for 2 years, and it was all about nothing, really.
So how did it resolve itself? Did it ever resolve itself, the two of you?
Yes, it did, and he has now retired from the legislature, or he's not running again, I should say. And he wrote me the nicest note that I've ever gotten from anybody, I think, saying how much he respected me as a legislator, that I was one of the best he'd ever worked with, which pleased me a great deal.
Well, good. Looking back, either a person or event, who's shaped you, Minette, or what's shaped you, do you think? I know you said that you grew up with not a lot of money and a pretty tough circumstances. Was it a teacher? Was it a parent? Was it somebody that you've met along the way in the political process?
I think, in thinking about it pretty casually, I think it was my mother who told me what I couldn't do and shouldn't do and how to behave, and then society also telling me the same thing at the time I was growing up, what girls were supposed to do. Society had very strict limits on what girls were when I was in high school and in college, too. Also, what wives should do. And then I think what changed me was the women who told me the limits that had been put on their lives because of society telling that. And even in my day, there were a lot of women who were trying to support their children without child support, without husbands anymore. And knowing how society had treated me, which was pretty good. My husband always provided a nice living, and we had nice children, and we had nice school systems, and we had nice Iowa City. I wasn't experiencing those, but when I found out how other women were really suffering, I mean, they were suffering. And it was because of the laws, and it was because of the limitations that society had put on them, and how they were not being helped by society, that changed me.
I read in another article about you that one of, and I quote, the old bulls in the Senate paid you a compliment by saying, I quote, "She's a tough adversary, but she's always prepared, and I learned a lot from Minette, end quote. As a tough adversary, are you tough-skinned as well?
I wasn't at that time. I spent many an evening having my feelings hurt, or many a episode. But I found that I could deal with the so-called old bulls. That was really kind of unfair, although maybe not. But I found that if I let them hurt my feelings, it hurt me, not them. And the tougher I was, the better they liked me, actually. So I never let them know when they hurt me, or I would hurt them back. And we did have pretty equal representation. You have to remember, at the most, when I served in the Senate, there were 3 women at any one time.
Now how many are there?
There's 6. We haven't grown that much, but I think this time we'll grow even more.
That's the Senate? It was
That's the
3,
Senate.
and now there's 6, and how about the House?
At the time I was there, when I first went, there were only 4 out of 108. But now there are about 18. So we've progressed a lot. And as a matter of fact, women are in many leadership positions in both the House and Senate now. We have a President Pro Tem, Jean Lloyd Jones, who's the President Pro Tem of the Senate. We have Mary Newhouser and Janet Adams, who are leaders, assistant leaders in the House. And the appropriations subcommittees that we have, most of the money that is allocated through committees chaired by women.
Now, do you women have kind of a network yourself, as when these new young women, or not necessarily young, not so young women arrive at the House or the Senate, do you kind of take them under their wing and tell them the process, some of the unwritten rules?
Well, we used to. We used to have a caucus. And when we worked strictly on family issues, we were pretty much in agreement, and then we've expanded a great deal into economic issues. And that's what taught me that just to give women their rights isn't quite enough. That is, their civil rights. What we have to do is give them their economic rights and encourage them to aspire to jobs that really pay well. And we individually now will take people under our wings. Many of the women who are in the legislature have been assigned to go to different districts and be a mentor to some of the women that are running. It's being handled. And men do the same thing with certain districts. And men do a lot for women. Actually, the men in the Iowa legislature in my 25 years, or 26 now, have been great, because we couldn't pass one thing without them, because they have an overwhelming number of the votes, and they're really quite reasonable. Even the old bulls, and I know who they were referring to then when they said that, never voted against a single woman's issue that I ever sponsored.
Another representative I read in an article mentioned that, talking about you, of course, she doesn't know the meaning of fear. She's very determined, and she never gives up, end quote. Is that how you perceive yourself? That you...
Well, I like to think I never give up. And I do persevere. And it is an education process. And I'm very sympathetic, because I didn't know about these things either. I didn't live them. But when society denies equality just because it's not in the law, but by actions, it's very detrimental to those people that we are denying equality to. And we deny it not only to them, but their children. And I think that's what's happened in Los Angeles. The people were very unaware of how oppressed those citizens felt, and they made them aware of it in a very negative way, in a very unresponsive way. So I think we've made great progress with women's issues in this state.
So if I were to ask, which I'm going to, over the last 26 years, what major changes, maybe in the political process, what you're telling me the major changes have been in laws for women's rights, children's rights, juvenile justice laws. What about, have there been any other major changes? I mean, this is, a quarter of a century you've been a part of this political process.
Well, I think economic changes for women have been dramatic. Sports equality, just this last week, the university went for equality of representation of women's sports. I mean, that is almost revolutionary. When I was a young girl, we didn't have women's sports. You know, they always say women, or Iowa was head of the game because we had girls basketball. We had such negative girls basketball. When I played in high school, but was only intramural, we only were allowed to go on a third of the court. A third. I always say they were protecting our ovaries from overkill, I guess. And now throughout these 28 years, we have fought to get half court, and now we have full court. And that's sort of the way it has worked with all of women's rights, and women's society has discovered that women are equal people, that we can run, and that we're very good athletes. There's been a dramatic change. And I know if you just look at yesterday, it's not a big change. But if you look over that quarter of a century, it's a dramatic change in economics, in athletics, in our society generally. And I think women feel more bonded to each other, even though they don't know each other. I've heard women say, I'll vote for every woman on the ticket, just because, and my own brother-in-law said that when my sister, said to my sister who said that, who lives in Florida, that she had voted for every woman on the ticket, and she's not a feminist, and she doesn't agree with me on a lot of things, but she had decided that the males had done a pretty bad job, and he said to her, but you don't know any of them. And she said, and you don't know any of the men you voted for either, which really surprised me. Because,
this is your sister? Excuse me.
She is a very traditional woman. She has worked out of the home only when they needed the money. But she came to this conclusion, I think as many other women have, that their economic rights, their social rights, and their political rights are wrapped up in other women moving ahead. And they think about their daughters and their grandchildren, and men are at this point too. They used to worry about their son making good. They worry about their daughter making good now, because we don't have the traditional marriages wherein supposedly a woman was supported throughout her lifetime. I don't think that was ever a reality for the majority, but it was the myth.
You know, talking about those changes, how about you? How have you, has your style changed? Did you go in, I mean, are you more mellow than you were 25 years ago? You said you've learned to take criticism and you're pretty tough skin, you don't let people know. How have you changed personally?
Well, I changed because when I went in, I was pretty shy. No one will believe this.
You were?
Yes, I was very shy. And I remember asking permission to have the mic turned on when we were not in session, so that I could make my first speech without being in session. And because I was scared. Cotton mouth, wobbly knees, all of those things that everyone, well, not everyone, but new to this situation sometimes people go through. But I did try to hide it. And I didn't let people know how scared I was. And I really was. It was a big, wonderful world that I had never participated in. And I have changed. I remember being so afraid of doing something that would be considered wrong or make a mistake, and now I don't worry about it. It's not that well, a legislator just retired and said I was brash. I think I was brash only because I had to be. People, when I went in, they just simply were very polite to the women. They treated them like they treat somebody totally unequal, but had to be taken care of. And I decided I wasn't going to let them take care of me, except to agree with me on votes. And the legislature has changed, too. The men are different. The young men aren't like the old gentlemen who would treat you as if you were a queen and then vote against you and put down your thoughts. They aren't that way anymore. Life has changed. The whole society has changed. It's really wonderful the way it's changed. And it's hard to explain to the young women now who can go into any graduate program they want to, or get any job if they're qualified for it, how it was before, where women were simply shut out, and society agreed that they should be shut out.
Tell me, I want to just talk a little personal about your family, not your political life. You met your husband up in Waterloo, is that correct?
No, I met him at Clear Lake, Iowa. He was from Mason City, and I had my first paid vacation from John Deere's, and I was with a woman friend of mine, and we rented a place, and he was home on furlough from the Army. And it was one of those vacation romances that they say aren't supposed to work. And we corresponded for 2 years, and then decided to get married, and saw each other on furlough and that sort of thing.
And tell me a little bit about your children. What are they about?
Dennis is in California. He's a script writer and a writer. And my daughter is in Florida, and she's a lawyer, and she has a small restaurant on the beach that she has the franchise on, and her husband pretty much supervises that. And they're both contributing citizens, and they both are very supportive of me.
That's great. I hope you can get down and visit them down in Florida.
I visit both of them at least once a year, and they come up once a year. So
that's good. What do you do, Manette, to relax when you're not studying bills and working with people?
I play tennis. That's my favorite sport, and fortunately there are a lot of people in this town that still want to play at the same age I am, and some older, and we do have a great time on the tennis court. I'm very competitive, I think, and I bought myself an exercise bike, and I have a difficult time forcing myself to ride it. Evidently, I need the competition to exercise.
I read that you play a pretty good game of tennis. In 1989, the Iowa Commission on the Status of Women awarded you the Equality and Justice Medal. Congratulations. This is a few years late, but that must have meant a lot to you.
It did. I think other than being put in the Hall of Fame of my high school in Waterloo, where I couldn't even get elected homeroom monitor.
Oh.
I think that...
Because you were from Grundy Center or
No,
something?
I was from Waterloo at that time.
Oh, you were at Waterloo at that time.
I was in high school, but I was shy. And that went to other people, always. I was the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks. And frankly, I never ran for it, you know. This is a myth about, that's one thing I learned in politics. It really is a myth when they say, my friends ask me to run. Usually you talk to your friends about should you run. And I didn't know that. I was always waited for somebody to encourage me, and it didn't happen. So I've forgotten where we were.
I was asking about the Equality Justice Medal.
Yes, and that in my high school Hall of Fame are the two things I prize very highly.
What do you want to accomplish before you leave the House?
Well, I hope that we can pass the Equal Rights Amendment.
That's number one on your agenda.
That's number one. And that we can continue to change the laws. In this pay bill that the legislature passed the last time, pay equity or comparable worth, which was very important to me in the 80s, where women's jobs that were dominated by women were point counted and then paid the same as men's jobs that were point counted the same points, were paid the same. That got lost in this last pay schedule. And we have a study in that bill, if the governor signs it, that will put us back to that schedule without the union having to fight for it. It will be the law. It is the law of the state of Iowa, but the way we parceled the money, it sort of got left out.
My last question is something very exciting you're going to take part in is the Environmental Summit in 1992, the summer of 1992. Are you going as a student, an observer, to learn as much as you can?
That's my whole purpose. We're also going to take a 3-day trip to look at the rainforest, which is very important to the world and to our air content worldwide. And we're going a trip on the river, and it's going to be pretty exciting, about 4 days before the conference. And then, no, I'm just an observer and a participator in the non-government part of that conference. And we will be listening to the meetings, we will be talking to other delegations and I personally will be trying to learn more about ecology and environment, which has not been one of the things that I have been active in.
Well, you've got a lot of time left.
That's right. Well, I know who I should follow, and that's what we do in the legislature. We cannot be experts on everything, but we decide which other legislators think like we do about certain things, and then if we don't have time to study it, we follow them. As many people follow me now on women's issues that don't have time to study them.
Well, Manette, it's been a privilege having you. I appreciate you coming.
Well, I've enjoyed it very much. You've stirred up memories that I'd sort of forgotten about.
My guest has been Manette Doderer. Her public career began in the 60s as a member of the Johnson County League of Women Voters. She served in the Iowa House from 64 to 68, the Iowa Senate from 69 to 78, and again in the House from 1981 to the present day. She was the first woman in the General Assembly to be elected to a leadership position when she was named House Minority Whip in the late 60s. She also served as President Pro Tem of the Senate in 1975. Minette has worked on a myriad of issues, including women's equal rights, corrections, educational reform, juvenile justice. Friend and foe alike call her a fighter with a sweet disposition. She was named to the Iowa Women's Hall of Fame in 1989, and the Iowa Commission on the Status of Women awarded her the Medal for Equality and Justice. Her record clearly speaks for itself. In Minette Doterer's own words, she has stated, I quote, "There's always something new you can find to be changed or upgraded. I have made a difference because the issues that I'm interested in don't get taken care of unless I'm here," end quote. Many voters are pleased that Minette has been in the legislature to deal with and influence worthy, critical, and important issues.